All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us at Lore Lords HQ. Last week, we talked about Dragon Ball Z Super and Dragon Ball Proper, and a little bit of GT. And this week, on the other hand, we're taking a step into the real world where Pat and Atlas are gonna figure out what the fuck is going on with, video game industry.
You forgot to mention Dragon Ball Heroes.
Fuck Dragon Ball Heroes.
No, that's the best part.
Yeah, I know. This guy's pretty aggressive. Hey, you two, why are you so mean?
He's a real dick, actually.
Yeah, he said he'd do the announcing for us at the beginning of every episode for free, so we're like, okay, and now he's like, can I go home?
I'm starting to doubt his validity as a voice actor, as a matter of fact.
Same.
I think he's not even a member of SAG.
Anyway.
Okay, so today I have prepared some stuff. I have pictures that I got ready. I wrote out a lot of notes. Everything I've talked about today, I have researched myself. I have watched multiple documentaries, and I have even researched their sources to look into the things. Read a lot of articles, a lot of interviews. Warning, it's going to start off pretty fucking thick and meaty. But as time goes on in this timeline, weirdly enough, less information becomes available. The more recent, the less I know. So it just starts to become numbers. So at the beginning, it's going to be a little intense. A lot of background that's kind of relevant, but I think kind of cool. And I'm just going to get right into it.
Let's do it.
And like any good video game development story, it starts in 1945.
Oh, wow.
Because that was the end of World War II.
Yeah.
And Japan was losing very badly. And in the Pacific theater, things were reaching a really bad time for Japan. America had begun their bombing raids. And this is pre-nuclear weapons. They were just dropping tons and tons of bombs all over the islands of Japan. In 1944... by the end of the war, they had destroyed so much city infrastructure and caused the deaths of between 241,000 and 900,000 casualties.
Jesus Christ.
And that number is only so different because Japan said less, but America said more. So we don't know how many it was actually that got killed. And one of the cities that was hit hardest was a city called Tokushima City. And Tokushima City was targeted by the 21st Bomber Command, because it was an agricultural center for the whole region. And at 5:45 on the July 3rd, 1945, 137 aircrafts took off and destroyed the city with 1,050 tons of incendiary bombs. This destroyed 74% of the entire city. So basically, it was entirely leveled. It was a huge farmland for most of the food in Japan at the time, and fed a lot of their troops, and dealt a serious blow. And also took out enough air defense to allow certain bombs that caused bigger explosions in two certain cities that we probably know what I'm talking about to take place. But that's just to set up the base for what happened after the war in the 60s. Japan was starting to come back in a major way, and although thousands of the people were left pretty much homeless in Tokushima, they had a massive reconstruction effort and rebuilt the entire city. And after some years, major results were seen. The former agricultural land was instead used for building factories to help keep the city itself growing and inviting new people in for working in factories, as Japan was now starting to become fully industrial for the first time. The effort was so successful that they even labeled the city as the New Industrial City of Japan. And one of the businesses that started at this time, in 1963, by a man named Kunoichi Miyamoto, established a company called Den-Yusha Electric. This was a power company whose whole purpose was to put power lines throughout Japan, because a lot of it didn't have any even before the war.
Oh, okay.
Just because Japan still had so many weird feudal island cities and villages going around.
Right.
And they also maintained the electric towers within the entire Tokushima region, which is still known for agriculture, but the city itself is a huge industry that's flourishing. I have a picture of the city actually right here. Where'd it go? Did I lose it? I have a picture of the bombing. There it is. That's a bombing of the city. So there's that. Here's the city. I can put it right on top of that. There you go. Look how nice it is now.
Oh, yikes. Look at all those bombs. Holy shit.
Yeah. There's the actual city on top of that. Oh,
that's beautiful.
Much nicer looking now.
That's so nice, yeah.
So
city skylines, you know what I'm saying? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it does look actually very city skylines. It's even got the little island out there that it's connected to by bridge. So the Miyamoto family, which founded Denyusha Electric, had amazing success doing this as the first big electric company in the area, and got so many government contracts with all the banks to establish power lines as money was starting to become less physical and more electric. But this is not an episode, as someone just asked what we're discussing. This is not an episode about power companies. This is an episode about video games. So we're going to take a boost forward, and this is actually about the son of Konoichi Miyamoto, Masafumi Miyamoto, who, weirdly enough, doesn't have a lot of pictures on the internet, but I found one that I can bring up right there on the left. And a little bit for his personal background. He grew up extremely wealthy because of all this.
I imagine so.
Yeah, his dad was like a savior of Tokushima City, and he grew up very wealthy. And according to him, he had a great childhood, and he was never wanting. When it came to greater education, he received every opportunity to succeed. And he attended Nara Junior and Senior High School in Kobe City. So this city is infamously strict, or not city, school, sorry, is infamously strict with notoriously difficult entrance exams. And they only accepted 1 out of every 50 students.
Jeez.
And a fun fact about this I feel like you would like, so I put this in there. On the school's board at the time was a man named Togado Kano. Do you know who that is?
Name sounds familiar, but no, not off the top of my head.
He's known as the father of judo.
Oh, shit.
He's the one who modernized judo. And at the time Masafumi went to the school, he was on the board. And one of the reasons the school was so acclaimed is not only was it a huge educational standard, every single student had to, male and female, had to attend very rigid and strict judo programs.
That's awesome.
So you knew how to kick ass and defend yourself and stay physically fit.
If I was president, I would implement everybody requires take martial arts in high school. Fuck yeah.
It's legitimately a great thing, not only for like fitness, but just self-defense and the mindset of it. That's such a great way to like educate people.
It's like my spirituality, dude.
Yeah, and I feel like people would be a lot more chill.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyway.
So back to his schooling, it's important to note at this point that he's extremely intelligent. Like he's not just like a rich kid; he's actually really good at school. Like
yeah, he was ambitious. And
he was super ambitious. And do you know who he is, by the way? Masafumi Miyamoto.
He's the one who made Nintendo, isn't he?
No, that's Shigeru Miyamoto. Similar last name. I had a feeling people were going to think that.
I did make that mistake.
Yes. So his classmates at the time they were also very big brain. He started making a lot of friends and people in the network and started doing a little networking. And when he graduated high school, he got accepted into Waseda University, which some people might know. It is one of Tokyo's biggest universities to this day. It's very prestigious to go there. And he went there and he began his plans for the future. And he had wanted to follow his dad's dream in entrepreneurship. And based on what this episode's about, can you guess what kind of business he wanted to start?
Video games?
Women's fashion, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
So we actually don't know why, but he had an extreme interest in women's clothing design. Like he wanted to be super into like that business and selling clothing for women.
Probably because a little horny.
Maybe. Or maybe he just saw it as a good money opportunity. At the time, I feel like style was probably really taking off in Japan. Like it was the 70s, you know?
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Late 70s,
yeah.
Early 80s, yeah. So it's like they're kind of like exploding with their own big cultural footprint.
Yeah,
But what we don't know, for some reason, around his graduation, his dream was completely dashed and forgotten. And he ended up graduating and joining his father, Denyusha Electric. I have a feeling, this is just my speculation, that based on the time that his father probably convinced him not to do that. Because a lot of these, which is going to come up again in a little bit, a lot of parents just wanted their kids to make money. And be successful. And like, oh, you want to make a fashion company? That's risky. Don't do it, kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And considering Masafumi was very intelligent, it's probably likely he was just like, you know what, you're right, it's safer to do this. So I'm just
Sure.
going to go with my dad's company. And after he joined them, however, he was still looking for ways to get into the fashion industry using his dad's company's resources.
Right.
And while he worked for them, we don't really know what he did. But in 1983, Japan is hit by one of the most monumental things to their entire country that will change it forever. Something happened that will change business and the worldwide look on Japan, and that was the advent of the home computer. Japan's businesses were hit with home computers, making many men and women have to learn their systems, how they work, something that the working class of Japan adapted better to than any other country in the world. Likely just due to their work culture. They kind of just like, they have a very strict office culture in Japan.
Yeah.
And they're probably like, if you can't learn, you're out.
Yeah, no, it's like you do this. It's like this is just how you do things now, whereas here we complain about it.
Yeah, so that was a huge deal. But this is the same time something else happened where Japan entered the worldwide computer scene, and many products jump-started their market into a tech race and a friendly rivalry that still exists today with America for kind of like who's got the best tech. As far as like home computers go and stuff.
Yeah, everyone can usually make a reference to that rivalry, which is nice. Yeah, it's a good one.
It's definitely the closest one. I would say the two tech giants for that kind of thing is America and Japan.
For sure, I agree.
The other thing that happened in the same year, Space Invaders, Galaga, and Pac-Man all came out, hit massive stores, and the invention of the arcade cabinet came along with it, and Japan got a huge obsession with the arcade cabinet, which, if you don't know, still is a thing now. People are obsessed with it. Oh, my music just started. That's fine. It's copyright free. We'll put it on. It's appropriate. It's city pop.
Oh, okay. Rock and roll.
Yeah. So businesses started selling so many arcade cabinets or buying so many arcade cabinets, like even convenience stores would have Pac-Man machines in them.
Right.
That companies started noticing that video games were becoming a real option for like profit.
Yeah.
And two major innovations came out in the same year. The personal computer, which was like a home computer, but I put in quotation marks, affordable.
Sure.
Because it was still really expensive, but it was something you could have in your house that wasn't $10,000 like a home computer was at the time.
Yeah.
And also the home console. And this was a specialized small computer for playing video games that was advertised towards children. And this was like the Atari, the Coleco, things like that.
Sure.
When Masafumi saw the home computer and saw video games, he believed this was only going to go up. And they were an untapped source of revenue that he could get in while it was fresh. And he wanted to use his father's business in the same way to make a smaller sub-company to create and sell games to make a ton of profits. His father accepted, but kept a close eye on it and kept control over it and wouldn't give him like access to anything. He had to ask Dad for permission first, basically.
Okay.
And he saw the success of Pac-Man specifically and thought, I could do this. And then looked into how it was made and realized it was made by one guy. And this was a huge problem because he had no idea how to code, write, compose music, or do any form of digital art. And at this time in history, it's important to note that every single game, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, etc., was made by one person. And Masafumi had the wild idea, while clearly one programmer can make it work, what if instead I got a team of specialists, like a writer, a composer, an artist, and a programmer, to work together and make a video game? And while now we think of this as an obvious thing, back then it literally had never been done.
Sure.
Which this was his plan, but still a problem because he didn't know anybody in that world. He had no connections to anyone in the video game industry, and no one with those talents that he even knew. And no one in the established world would agree to work with some guy who had no history in computers from a power company. So instead, he set his eyes on students at local universities as candidates for recruiting into this business. And so to do this, he had another crazy idea, which also kind of changed the scape of a lot of things, where he just opened a rental shop for personal computers, where for an hourly fee, you could go in and use a PC, because people didn't have them. So he opened dozens of PCs, and at the same time inventing the LAN cafe, or computer cafe, that we know now. But at the time, it was just a little idea he had, and it took off like crazy. Because students could now do things, especially high-level coding, at this little computer rental store, which he opened up right across from Keio University, which is one of the highest tech universities in Japan at the time. He had a dozen personal computers that charged an hourly rental fee. And this was essentially the first computer cafe, and he advertised as a place for students to do their schoolwork. Using a computer for a cheap hourly fee, its actual purpose was to recruit a team of developers, which would naturally form by being regulars at the cafe. So it kind of had a hidden purpose, but he actually was making pretty good money renting computers out.
Hey, wait, of course.
But this is a big deal because 3 people would meet here in a crazy star-aligning situation.
Fuck yeah, let's go.
Hizashi Suzuki, Hiromichi Tanaka, and one that people listening might know the name of, I don't know if you do, because he's one of the fathers of video games, is Hironobu Sakaguchi. Do you know who he is?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to go into the background of these 3 people a little bit.
Sure.
But I'm not going to go super deep. But the first one, Hizashi Suzuki, was the first one to join up, and he was also from an affluent background, just like Miyamoto was.
Yeah.
But his background is basically the same, but he went to Keio University instead of Waseda, and he was an economics student. And he worked for a company called the Koei Group, Koey, and they were a failing company that declared bankruptcy just a few years ago. And when that happened, the owner stepped out, and the owner's son took over, and they were selling clothing dye. That was their whole business.
Wow.
Which the owner hated, and also China controlled the market for.
Yeah.
So it was just a completely dead idea. And so the owner said, fuck this, I'm going to redesign this, and we're going to sell video games.
Nice.
And so he renamed the company Koei. Koei, which we know now.
Yeah.
They make, Dynasty Warriors and the Warriors games, which is one of my favorite series of all time. And he worked for this company. And here's the fact. He worked on their game, Battle of Kawakajima, in 1981, which was their first release. And a game called Nightlift, which was a sequel, which was the world's first adult erotic video game.
Let's go.
And in 1983, they released Nobunaga's Ambition, with the help of Hizashi Suzuki actually directly working on the game itself. Which is a title still going on today. Still sequels to that. But he left pretty soon after to join Denyu and work with Miyamoto at that cafe and help his efforts to create a company.
All right. So now we're caught up with him.
Yeah, so Suzuki's in. He's down to join up. The rental business was doing okay and making money. But Suzuki was the only candidate that had actually clicked with Miyamoto and liked the plan. So he needed to start... And Miyamoto was a little scared that people weren't clicking with him as he hoped they would and getting together. So he decided, I'm going to make as much profit from this business as I can. I'm going to open it up for, instead of 10 hours a day, it's going to be open for 16 hours a day. And to do this, I need to hire a staff, so I need to hire a clerk. And he put an ad in the paper, and he got 1 response after a month. And that man was Hironobu Sakaguchi. And Sakaguchi was the first person I saw to be poor. He didn't come from anything. He grew up in a academic path where he wanted to be a musician, essentially. And nice. he grew up with dreams of being a musician, and like I mentioned before, Dad said no, music's bad, you can't do that, you're not going to make any money. So he said, okay, I'm going to go to school to be an electrician, which is what his dad kind of recommended because electronics were booming like crazy in the 80s. So he went to Yokohama National University to study electronics, and he didn't care. He hated it. He absolutely didn't like working in this. He was doing engineering work, which isn't something you feel like you do if you don't like it.
Yeah.
But what it did do is he got to be introduced to a device called the Apple II.
Oh, yeah.
And the Apple II introduced him to video games, and he was one of the only people of his peers who actually wasn't into Japanese games. He liked American games. So much so that he became obsessed with the Western action-adventure games Wizardry and Ultima. And he would spend most of his free time. He wouldn't do homework. He would just play Wizardry. He would just play Ultima all day and night. And he was so desperate to play the sequels that were coming out that his Apple II was only at school, so he wanted his own, but he couldn't afford it. Yeah. So he was looking for a part-time job. And he applied to 2 major companies, Namco and Konami. And they both said no because we don't know who you are, and you don't even know how to work an arcade. You know how to work a computer. And so he said, okay, fine, I'll look for normal part-time work. And his whole reason he was looking for a part-time job was to get enough money to build his own Apple II with secondhand parts.
That's actually awesome.
Yeah, so he was just going to like weird electronic like underground stores that were selling illegal computer parts and putting together like his own Apple II because he was an engineering student, so he knew how to do it. And so he saw the ad for the rental cafe, and took it. And he joined the company as a clerk, and he started talking to Suzuki and Miyamoto, and they immediately realized they just found their new team member. He was not only interested in the business, but he had a very creative look on games because of his obsession with Western games.
Sure.
No one else really had talked about this to them before. And he also had some coding knowledge. But Sakaguchi didn't feel good at codings, and he actually recommended his friend, who worked with him, who went to school with him, to join up, who worked at the Yokohama engineering department, Hiromichi Tanaka. And did a little bit of his background, which also I have pictures of these guys I could throw up. There's Sakaguchi, there's Tanaka, there's Suzuki. It goes Suzuki, Sakaguchi's with the mustache, he's very famous for that, and then Tanaka on the side, on the final side. I put Sakaguchi in the middle because he's kind of the main character here. So Tanaka and Sakaguchi both were failing at school.
Oh no.
And while Sakaguchi was obsessed with Western video games, Tanaka was obsessed with Astro Boy, Ultraman,
Nice. Yes,
and
go.
other huge Japanese anime series. He was a massive anime fan. And he was very interested in like writing and stuff like that. But he was a much better coder than Sakaguchi. But even though they didn't have he didn't have more experience.
Sure.
He still was just like, he was a little bit more adept at it. And he got hired as a programmer. And this was the team assembled. These four are the four people who started this whole endeavor. And they decided we're going to make a game, but we're not going to do what a lot of companies do, just go out of the blue. We're going to make a licensed product.
Ah, all right. Yeah.
Because they thought we were too amateurs to do this. And so we're going to have to make a game from an IP that already exists. And before that, they said, we need to have a company name. We need to make a name that people will be able to recognize us with. And so they came up with the name Square. And that's what our story is about. And here's a little fun fact about that. So Miyamoto made the name Square because of this golfing grid pattern, the square grid.
Okay.
Because he liked golfing, and he was so embarrassed with his story, he actually told Sakaguchi to come up with something creative about it. And just make some story up about her name.
That's good. I like that. Oh man, I want to see this movie. They need to make this movie.
It's and the best part about that story of them making the name, no one even knows the story's lost. It was only put in one newsletter, and that's all. There's no copies of it in existence that we know of.
Oh.
But employees at the time said it probably had something to do with the term squaring up to the competition.
Oh.
Like that was the tagline that Sakaguchi wrote in, and so that's what we think it was.
Okay.
And their first game is hilarious. It's called Birdman Rally. And Birdman Rally is a Japanese game show, which is just as wild ass of a Japanese game show as you would imagine.
Sure. Yeah.
It was a game show where people would make a human-powered flying machine.
Oh.
And try to go as far as they could into the ocean.
Oh my god.
So they would like run off ramps holding wings and like go.
Yeah,
and some of them had like bicycles inside that would like power flapping wings and stuff like that.
Fuck yeah. I've seen people do that kind of stuff before, but that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a whole game show about this. And they're like, let's make a game about it because it's wacky.
Yeah.
It's wild. Here's the problem. They didn't have permission.
Oh no. Oh, why did you... How do you fuck that up?
So they just made a game without permission.
Oh my god.
And here's another thing. He convinced the company that when it was completed, they could sell the game to them. So they're going to make the whole game before asking for permission.
Jesus Christ.
And the team didn't agree. Sakaguchi mostly was like, this seems really iffy. He didn't really want to do it, but he said, we need the experience anyway, so let's make the game. And they ended up getting over their head and needed another programmer because Sakaguchi and Tanaka both sucked at it. And they hired a man named Hironobu Kato, who was someone who would stay with Square for years.
Oh.
In fact, he might still be part of it. I'm not sure.
Wow.
But at this time, he was a high school student. He didn't even graduate. He was just in high school. He had made a little game, and they just asked if he wants to join up. And he said, yeah, sure. But this whole situation had a lot of problems. Sakaguchi is on record saying he actually thought at this point Square was a scam. And that he had fallen for it because his contract was a part-time clerk. And when they started working on the game, his pay went from being hourly to only getting paid at the completion of the game.
Oh no.
And everyone else's contract, we're not 100% sure with, but we think it was the same. They all only were promised payment at the end of the game's creation.
My God. That's scary contract.
Yeah. Another issue was if the game was rejected, would they even get paid? Like, what would they get paid? Denyu had money, but this wasn't Denyu. It was Square now. It was its own entity. And for the record, Dad basically said, it's your show now. Like, I don't want to be involved in this.
Yeah.
Like, run the show.
Yeah.
Well, the fear was met because the company rejected it.
Yeah.
Said, no, we're not going to make this. This is trash. This is stupid. But Sakaguchi and Tanaka and Suzuki, they decided to stay on because they learned a lot. They had made a game. It didn't sell anything, but it worked. Like, it was a functional product. And they thought, we can make an actual game now and sell it. Let's make our own title. And Miyamoto said, go for it. It's up to you guys. He's going to run the... Miyamoto now is going to take a huge back seat. I don't even know if we're going to mention his name again. He's just basically like the boss. He's just the one they run ideas by. He says yes or no.
Sure.
And deals with the money. And their first title, which I actually have the box for here, which is great. It's called The Death Trap. And you can see the name on the bottom left. There's Square. The very first Square game. And a fun fact about this game is that picture of a gun with that, like, cigarettes, that's Sakaguchi's desk. With an airsoft gun. And a pack of cigarettes he bought that morning. And I think he said it was tea in a cup to look like whiskey.
That's funny.
So that's how low budget they were. He just got a camera and took a picture of his desk with some stuff on it. And this game is a text-based narrative game, which was at the time very popular. And the development was where Sakaguchi got his nickname, the Goblin, because of his taskmaster-like work ethic and forcing people to work long hours and not letting them have long breaks. But considering this project was run by young students and high schoolers even, it really took his taskmastership to, like, keep them on track. And it drove him over the edge, and he's even credited in the game credits as Hironobu Goblin Sakaguchi. He hired some more specialists as well to work on graphics and writing. He actually got, I don't know their names, we don't have records of this, but he got graphical artists and writing literary students to work on writing it. And in 1984, it released on the PC. And it ships into stores and sold 3,000 copies.
Nice.
Which
okay.
it's not good.
No,
but it made a little fanfare. People kind of liked it. It made 31 million yen, which is $120,000 at the time, and development costs is probably around $1,000. So that's a pretty good. That's a good. Plus.
It's not an L. It's not.
No,
an L.
exactly, and that attitude is what kept them going. It wasn't a big release, but they said, "Hey, we can make games. Like, we can do this. Like, this is actually real. This could happen." And so they came up with 2 more game ideas that they're going to come up with, one of which was a sequel, which we have a picture of there, Will Death Trap 2. And a whole new game, which was an American train simulator game called Amtrak. Another huge thing happened also this year, 1984, was the creation of the SST, or the Super Software Team, which is something that's been long forgotten. But a lot of small companies, some of which still exist, most of which have been dissolved or eaten up by other companies, got together and started pooling money and resources to create games, which was unheard of at the time. And this now gave them, like, a pretty big ambition hit, and they were pretty into, like, we have this money now, we have a team, people recognize us as a developer because we made a game.
Yeah.
So they put this ad out in a newspaper that instead of just these 2 games, they were going to release 4 games in 1985 and 1 game in 1986. Now, this is really ambitious because this is still only this team of, like, 4 people.
Yeah,
like, there's 4 people, and then they hired specialists, not like staff members. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you would come in and do art for us and leave. That was it. But they kept doing it anyway. And Sakaguchi was made the leader of the A team, and 2 other games were going to be published, and he was doing Will 2 with the A Team, and 2 other games are going to be published were on to be put out on other platforms such as like the ColecoVision, that kind of like weird little home consoles, and help publish other companies' works. So they 2 of them were just publishing jobs. They just kind of did a bit of like coding on. They didn't actually have to make the games, so it was a lot easier than it looked. And they were going to make a game called Genesis in 1995 or 1895. Sorry. 1985 is what I'm trying to say, was their last game, and that was going to be made by Tanaka, who is now the B team leader, and this is going to be their first RPG ever, and the last game to be released was going to be this game, which I'm going to put here next to Will. This game is Cruise Chaser Blasty. People might have heard of Cruise Chaser Blasty. There's even a boss in Final Fantasy XIV called Cruise Chaser Blasty as a reference to this game. And this game made a lot of waves back in the day.
Dope.
You can so that's one of the biggest things. Look at that artwork.
Fuck yeah, dude.
If you have that compared to Death Trap 2 artwork, which I just put right next to it.
Yeah.
Completely like one's like a little pixel art of like an anime style character. That's like a crazy mech battle scene.
Yeah, hell yeah. Mech battle scene for days.
Yeah, so that was going to be their 1986 release, which today still actually has like a small cult following. It was a mecha style RPG. And it was promoted by a full-page ad, which also was expensive. But that we'll get back to that in a minute. First, Will 2, Sakaguchi was his first time ever made music, which was his dream as a kid. So that was a huge deal for him. He got to make music for this game. It released and sold 100,000 copies, making 600 million yen. Yeah, compared to the first one, which made 31 million, that's a fucking huge uptake.
Big W, baby.
Yeah, huge success for them. Amtrak, canceled.
Yep. Oh.
Trashed. Then no one wants to play a train sim. We're done. And yeah, just to comment on what it was said about Yeti Ringler in chat, $1,000 including salary. So that was, it was only $1,000 to make that first game. And I think they also made the first Death Trap game in like 3 months. So it was a very small developed game. So, they're now making money. And this also, the money made from Will 2 was noticed by someone else. Another game company. And Masafumi made a deal with them to sell games on a larger scale outside Japan. And this company was Nintendo.
Wahoo!
So now the big Mario Bros. Themselves was partnering with Square to make games around the world and just sell in more spots because they had better providers for games.
Yeah.
But the problem was they had only ever coded PC games. Nintendo was exclusively making games for the Famicom, or the NES as we know it. And it was just becoming too hard to ignore. At first, they didn't like the Famicom, but at this point, 20% of all households had one.
Wow.
And this wasn't just something that coexisted with PCs. This is something that was stealing their market share. So it had to be something they worked on at the time.
They had to get involved.
Exactly. If they ignored it too long, they'd be left behind. And it was on June 24th, 1985, Square became Nintendo's 7th third-party developer.
Nice.
And this also spelled the end of the Death Trap series, which while it had unexpected success, it was just they couldn't fit the port. The version of Will could not be ported to the Famicom. It was too big. The files were too big to fit on a cartridge. So instead, they started porting other smaller published games they had made previously onto the Famicom, and they met with great success, giving them even more money.
Yay!
And it started to show that Square was a real business, and other businesses started respecting them. And at this time, they officially separated from Denyu-sha. And Square became known as what we know now as Squaresoft.
Yeah.
And this saw Sakaguchi as their big hit. He was like becoming known in the world. He had made a couple games, and now it was time to work on Cruise Chaser Blasty, where he would get a huge promotion and get the job of director. And the project was also huge, and at this time was pretty original in the industry, because they not only needed... This was also, for the record, their last PC game. This was a PC game. Mm-hmm. It was not in the Famicom. Mm-hmm. It had 3D graphics, which in 1986, crazy. You know, it was obviously very early, like voxel graphics.
Sure,
but it had 3D graphics, and they also had partnered with a company you probably have heard of called Sunrise to create an animation about this game. So it's out there still. You can see it. There's an OVA called Cruise Chaser Blasty, which is a little short, kind of advertising the game more so than like plot based thing, but it's kind of cool. I watched some clips of it on YouTube. It's kind of cool.
Okay.
But the other thing is they needed music, and while Sakaguchi liked making music, he himself said, "I'm not good at it. Like, it's not my specialty. Like, I never practiced. I just kind of knew some notes, right?"
Sure.
So they need to look for a composer, and they found a man who is now renowned worldwide as the greatest game composer of all time. They found Nobuo Uematsu. And in 1985, this now legend of a composer was extremely desperate for work, and he was sending out demo tapes every day, and he would make commercial jingles, and my favorite, porn soundtracks.
Yes, let's go.
So I love the idea that this legendary composer started off making porn music.
Dude, I mean, everyone's got to make music and start somewhere.
It's just that's never an avenue of like that I would ever consider.
Oh, there
music.
are a lot of people who've become successful because they worked on porn. Editors, like video editors, music
That
people,
makes more sense to me though than music.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well,
like, man,
people,
you know what?
yeah.
I was watching like, you know, whatever Naked Chicks Volume 5 last night, and that soundtrack just hit different, you know?
Dude, I'd be lying if I said I haven't watched porn with soundtrack before, because it's sometimes you get a good soundtrack, you like the music more than what you're seeing. You stop watching the video and you go on and do something else.
I've never had that experience, but you know what? I'm glad you have.
Well, I figured I'd share that anyway. Keep going.
That's good. No, it's good. It's good to talk about this. So Uematsu got hired on as a composer. They loved the soundtrack so much they made a vinyl soundtrack and a game soundtrack had never been made before. So this is the very first. And when you bought the game, it came with the animation, a novel,
cool,
and the soundtrack. You got all three.
Yeah,
but guess what? It was a flop.
Oh, that sounds like a great thing, though.
Didn't make a huge splash.
Oh, no.
The gameplay was considered to be clunky and convoluted, and it was so very adult thematic, so children couldn't play it.
Oh.
And the PC games were at a decline compared to the Famicom, so it was just kind of not a bunch of stuff together. And this game revenue, the game did make good revenue though. Like it made a decent amount. I couldn't actually find out how much it made. Just references to how much what it made bought them their office. So now this whole time they had been working out of that rental cafe.
Oh wow! Wow.
So
really?
now,
so that's a lot.
This whole time they've been in a rental cafe. So now they're moving to an office, which is huge. So they made enough money. So at this point, Sakaguchi stopped taking classes, but kept paying tuition for school because he was afraid if they failed at Square, he would be able to go back to school, right?
Right.
So he was still enrolled. He wasn't taking classes. Tanaka, on the other hand, had failed so many classes he couldn't graduate. But because of his work at Square, he had been getting job offers through the university from large software companies, not game companies, like accounting software and stuff like that. And the school told him, if you accept this, we're going to graduate you with full colors, and you'll get this job. So Tanaka said no. And he went full-time at Square, which actually got him expelled and brought public shame on his professor.
Oh, fuck. Jeez, that's sad.
On the good side, at Square, he got rewarded with being the director for their next title, which is called Alpha, which, also, sorry, I lied. The Alpha was their last PC game. Goose Station Glassy was PC. Alpha is their last one. I'm not going to go too heavy into Alpha, but two major notes. One, it was super erotic.
Okay.
And had brief nudity.
Oh my god.
And they hired another major player in Square who's also very famous in the art scene, Kazuko Shibuya. So she is a huge artist, and she worked on Area 88 and this little anime series called Transformers. But she hated working under companies like Sunrise so much because of all the red tape, because she was an artist.
Yeah.
That she ended up focusing on graphical art and joined Square to do their next game, which was Alpha. And they had a bunch of specialists come and go and turn over in the staff, but now they have Suzuki, Tanaka, Sakaguchi, Uematsu, and Shibuya as like permanent payroll members. They also had another member join who was Kazuki Aoki, who I hadn't talked about yet, but since the first Death Trap, he had basically been an assistant for Sakaguchi and basically was just learning everything from him.
Oh, okay.
And at this point, he's become pretty higher up, and Sakaguchi trusts him more than like anybody in the company. And so after Alpha launch, it sold okay, but it didn't do that well. Again, because of a PC game. But they started developing games only for the NES, and Sakaguchi wanted to make an RPG because he loved Wizardry and Ultima. And he said, these are so much fun, I want to make a game like this. Yeah. And the bosses, a.k.a. Miyamoto, said, no one wants to buy that. We can't fit it. It's not worth the effort to make that game on the NES or Famicom because people won't be able to. It'll be small and dinky. Who won't play it? He said, okay, fine, whatever. I'll work on these games. And they ended up actually by 1987, so only 1 year, made 13 games.
Wow.
And these 13 games were all on the NES, and they were all shit.
Oof.
They sold horribly. They reviewed horribly. Square was struggling to stay afloat. Their companies around them who had previously gawked at for their failures were now rising above Square. Nintendo was considering dropping Square because of how bad they were doing. And one shining company formed out of nowhere and released a huge game. And this company was Enix, and that game was Dragon Quest. And Japan lost their fucking mind. And now we're going to go back in time a little bit to go, which is much less in-depth because there's not as much information about it, Enix. In 1947, a man named Yasuhiro Fukushima was born. He grew up, became an architect, studied in school for a bunch of different forms, said, fuck this, I hate working for companies, I want to make my own company, like many people do, and did back then especially, and created the Idansha Boshu Service Center in 1975. And he was an architect, but he sold real estate. He did work in real estate, and he just basically made magazine ads. All he did was make magazine ads for other apartment buildings to sell apartments. Okay. And they ended up making him enough money where he made another subsidiary, while still doing that mainly, for trading and brokering real estate nationwide, which is what he wanted to do, reached too far, and the company completely collapsed after a year. So he had to go back to making adverts, which he did until 1982, where he created Idansha Systems, which was that company to sell real estate, and they named themselves the Enix Corporation. And the Enix would start making its wild shift from real estate to video games, for the same exact reason as they saw as a source of untapped revenue. But Enix, unlike Square, didn't actually want to make games. They just wanted to profit off of others' games, and had no interest in getting and learning anything to make these games. And this is the beginning of a wild-ass story, which made Enix one of the most unpopular companies in the world. In Japan, especially. This story is just shady as hell. So, magazines at this time would feature programmers who made games, and they would release them for free.
Sure.
And it was a lot of them had cult followings. They were getting pretty substantial. And Enix came up with this crazy idea. They started looking at these magazines, and they announced they were going to hold a competition pitting programmers against each other. Programmers who made the best game would have their game published by Enix, a publishing company, granting them prizes of money and vacations. Enix contacted plenty of up-and-comers at the time for these magazines and strong-armed them into participating by means of coercion. And we don't know any more than that. We don't know what they said to these people, but people said, on record, they were never threatened, but they were convinced to join this competition. And then Enix made this huge guilty public piece saying that we are spending all our money in this competition. If this game that we're promoting to publish through this failed, Enix would have to close their doors, and they were willing to take this risk because it's the right thing to do to support independent freeware developers. And the people started saying, Enix is so great, they're amazing, they're the good guys. Let's buy the game from these. The people will become martyrs doing this, right? Yeah. Like, we're going to stand with Enix. So this was a massive fucking lie. Enix had no risk for this entire endeavor. They had tons of money backing them up, and they were being manipulative to get people to make a game for them. But the large amount of reputable developers and the magazines attached to the company made it look legitimate, and people started competing. And even if the game didn't sell well, it would probably sell enough that the competition's attention, people were paying attention, would probably buy it, and it would break even at least. And now the worst part of this whole fucking scam is the prize. So the ad stated, which I tried to get a picture of and I couldn't find it, but I saw some of the documentaries, but I just started looking for pictures like a couple minutes ago. Couldn't find it. But so the ad stated you would win 1 million yen, royalties on every copy sold, and a trip to attend Apple Fest 1983 in the United States of America.
Jesus.
So this is a fantastic thing, right? You would want to do that if you had the skills.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So here's the deal. That 1 million yen was actually an advance payment of royalties. So that's one thing. And secondly, Apple Fest 1983 sounds great, but it was actually a dinky, basically garage-sized computer expo in San Francisco. And not only that, but Enix thought no game could sell so little they couldn't afford to pay 1 million yen to the creator, who thought they were getting 1 million yen plus royalties.
Yeah.
And a trip to a huge game convention in America. And this caused, when this ended, this caused massive outrage in the programming community, and people started blacklisting Enix.
Oh.
But fortunately for Enix, it didn't extend outside that community, and they were able to contain the bad press.
Yeah, that's usually how it goes.
But something great happened from this for Enix. The winning game was Love Match Tennis, which was a little tennis game made by a man who people might also recognize, Yuji Hori. Yuji Hori was a literary graduate from Waseda University, same university as Miyamoto, and he worked as a freelance writer for papers and comics, but he won the competition, ditched his writing jobs, and went solely into game development because he not only loved doing it, which also, let's get these guys off screen. We'll go to the Enix people. I have some pictures for them too. Hori is famous for his shades. There's a picture of him from the 80s with his cigarette and shades inside, as any cool guy does.
Yeah.
So he started going fully into this video game stuff. He loved making it, had a lot of fun. He kept his one writing job, which was a side weekly comic in the magazine Shonen Jump. Hori went to Apple Fest. Besides being extremely disappointed about it, he actually discovered a game. Wizardry.
Oh, yeah.
We've talked about Wizardry before.
Yes.
Hori was obsessed with Wizardry, just like our other friend Sakaguchi. And this changed his opinion on games. And he became obsessed with RPGs and made Portopia. That was the game he made for the company Enix. This is a little text-based game similar to Death Trap. Sold a lot better than Death Trap, and actually is responsible for Metal Gear in the future.
Metal Gear.
This was the direct inspiration for Metal Gear's Portopia. And a composer named Koichi Sugiyama reached out to Enix, saying the music that they made for Portopia was so good that they deserved praise.
Yeah.
Sugiyama was a famous pop writer at the time.
Oh, okay.
He was big. Like, he was actually a known composer. And Enix said, "Do you want to make a game with us?" That was their immediate response. There was no cordial stuff. Like, you want to work with us, please?
Help. Make it.
Yeah. So he's like, okay, sure. You guys are good. I'll do that. And so he made the soundtrack for 2 more games, World Golf and Wingman 2. And in 1986, I have a picture of him too. In 1986, they made the Holy Trinity of Enix, as it's called nowadays, which was when they began working on their great RPG. So Sugiyama was more than happy to work with Hori on this new game he was working with, which he was going to inspired by on Wizardry. It was going to be a big RPG, and he needed the music. Sugiyama, like I just said, super down. He said, "Let's do it. Your games are great. I'm into this." And he needed an artist. So he went to people he knew, tried to get an artist, and because he still had this column at Shonen Jump, which he decided to close, he ended his Shonen Jump work to make this game. He hired, at the time, a rather unknown artist by the name of Akira Toriyama.
Let's fucking go.
Yeah. So there he is on screen. That's the Holy Trinity of Enix. Hori, Sugiyama, and Koriyama. Akira Toriyama made a bunch of great art for the game. If you look up the Dragon Quest,
yeah, it looks. I've seen it before. It's super.
Yeah,
cute.
art. It just looks like Dragon Ball. It's what you expect. It's Toriyama's art.
Yeah.
They hired a director named Koichi Nakamura, and this game was the first game to have a streamlined interface on the. This was also for the Famicom for record. Streamlined interface with his amazing programming skills, amazing art by Toriyama, amazing music by Sugiyama. The pieces fell together, and Hori's biggest game came out by the name of Dragon Quest. Now, market analysts said fantasy RPGs are guaranteed failures. Nothing that's an RP that's fantasy was going to succeed. People liked guns. That was the guns and sports. That was the games at this time. Like that Crew Chaser Blasty, for example. That was a big sci-fi game, right? Yeah, that's what people liked. Yeah. So they were wrong. Remember how much Death Trap 2 sold for and how great that was for them with 300,000 copies sold?
Yeah.
Month 1, Dragon Quest, 1.5 million copies sold.
Yeah, fantasy RPGs, they suck.
Yeah, terrible. No one would want this.
No one wants that.
Enix became one of the household names of Japan. People were huge fans. Nintendo said, please let us work with you. Please, Enix-san. Work with us. Let us sell your game in America. And they're like, that's a great idea. We'll sell it in America. So, fast forward a couple years, 1989, it's finally localized. That's how long it takes to localize a game back then. It was 2 years. It came out under the name of Dragon Warrior on the NES. Assuming the game was similar to Legend of Zelda, they produced 1 million copies, and it sold about 50,000. Much to their disappointment, America didn't like it. Reviews at the time called it dated, saying it was too old. It was an old style game.
Sure.
Remember that word I just said, dated, and ended up giving out free copies of Dragon Warrior with Nintendo Power.
Wow.
That to get rid of their stock for one and to boost popularity. But as soon as it started to take off, Nintendo's new star child was on the horizon. Back to 1987, Square was failing. Sakaguchi got his approval finally after the crushing success of Dragon Quest on the Famicom to make an RPG. And he formed his team immediately, but his Goblin nickname made everyone at Square not want to work with him.
Yeah.
And he only got 3 people to volunteer. And when he went to outside hires to fill the gap, namely 3 big names, Koichi Ishii, Akatoshi Kawazu, who are 2 people with Square still today. And the last member of the team was Nazir Gabelli, who was an Iranian-American programmer. So this is our first non-Japanese team member of any of these games that we have so far. We'll put Sakaguchi back on screen. There he is. So he's putting this team together, and he's also such a big fan of Nazir, who is famous for making 3D shooter games. He invented the whole idea, like Doom, that kind of stuff. That was his programming. Sakaguchi was such a big fan of him that when he met, he flew over to Japan and he asked for his autograph. So imagine your new boss asking for your autograph as soon as you arrive.
That's really amazing, though.
And Nazir didn't even know what an RPG was, and there's a famous quote where he told Nazir, the combat's going to work by when you attack your opponents, you're going to lower their hit points. And Nazir said, what are hit points? So Sakaguchi famously told him, just code what you're told to code. And Nazir did. He did work excellently. And drawing from the same inspirations as Dragon Quest, for what Hori did with Wizardry and Ultima, he decided he's going to draw even more from them and added in the elemental weakness system to this game. For example, undead are weak to fire. Fire beats ice, that kind of thing.
Yes.
The ability to make your own party, which are both features standard in Western RPGs and had never reached Japan. And he wanted his own artist, just like Dragon Quest. This is another great story. So Ishii, one of the new developers he hired, had recommended an artist, Yoshitaka Amano. And based on Sakaguchi's description of what he wanted, Ishii said, this guy's perfect. Sakaguchi said, no, I don't know who that is. I only want a famous artist. We need to be like Dragon Quest. We need to get artists who have like Shonen Jump stuff, right? Like people who are famous. But I want it to be more classical Japan. Yeah. And he showed all these clippings of magazines he had. And they looked at the artists. And it was Yoshitaka Amano. So the same person he turned down was the person who actually made the art that he was inspired the project by. They contacted him, he got the job, and he was now Final Fantasy's artist.
Let's fucking go.
Uematsu was brought on again as a composer. Development was in full swing. Square was approaching bankruptcy. The B team was assigned to assist their development to make it hit their deadline. Sakaguchi made a demo cartridge, sent it out to magazines everywhere, and they basically all said no. We don't even want to review this. Like, your company's trash. We don't like you. That was the basic response he got. And Square, it was at release time, Square ordered 200,000 copies made. Sakaguchi actually went and begged the bosses and said, please make 400,000 copies, because that was their company policy for sequel. If it sold 400,000, they could make a sequel. And they said, you know what, we're already banking everything on this. Let's make 400,000 copies. So they did. They sent it out. And if this game failed, Sakaguchi would go back to university, study electronics. Square would have to declare bankruptcy. And it was their final chance of success and earned its title, Final Fantasy. And that's a pretty famous story. Like, I know you've heard that story before.
Yeah, I know that part.
It's not true.
Wait, so
that is a myth about the whole title idea. There was, yes, they did kind of have their backs to the wall. And the quote from Sakaguchi said is, "This has mostly been blown up over time with a fun story, which adds a great mythos. And while our backs were to the wall, yes, that's true. Anything with an F would have been fine. Because it was called Final Fight, and they actually had to cancel the name Final Fight because another tabletop RPG had just released with that name. So they actually were in a scramble for a name, and fantasy just fit because it was a fantasy game.
Yeah.
And the game hit the shelves. Everyone was freaking out. Was Square going to close down? And in the first week, all 400,000 copies were sold. An additional 200,000 copies got emergency order for the MSX, which is basically just a PC.
Yeah.
And they also sold out the next week. Nintendo will be made responsible for holding its American release, and it would sell higher than it did in Japan. But compared to Dragon Quest, its Japan release was only a small success. Like in Japan, Dragon Quest was just crushing it.
Yeah.
But America ate the fuck out of Final Fantasy. It sold an estimated 2 million American copies. And this is insane at the time. No one has sold games like that outside of Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah.
That was nuts. People were losing their mind. Final Fantasy opened America to the JRPG. It was new, but familiar. They were new RPGs. They went fucking nuts. Dragon Warrior was out. Thrown away. America's just won a Final Fantasy. And Enix, as a result of this, lost their Nintendo contract.
Well, what a surprise.
Nintendo's like, get out of here. We have our new kid. Square's our baby, not Enix. And Enix had another big problem. They had no more international company, so they had to open up their own. Luckily, Enix, remember, it had that realty background, so it did have money. And in Japan, they were already releasing Dragon Quest Warrior 4.
Oh.
But they had to open up an American localization company, which is took the name Enix America. And they started working on a port of Dragon Quest 2. So this is already 2 games behind for the NES. Dragon Quest Warrior 2 got a huge rehaul and a massive improvement on its gameplay to be made over the first game to be made more appealing to the fans, and it actually left only 10 bytes of space in the cartridge.
Wow. Because
it was so big. And they put even a little more changes in that 10 bytes for the Western release to make it a little more accommodating to the West. And when it came out, the review said, this is too hard, and it's awfully dated.
Oh, again.
So it sold okay, but the reviews were so bad, they were kind of very discouraged. And this dated word is something, again, keep that in mind. Dragon Quest 2 is hailed to this day also as one of the hardest games of all time. It's like just ludicrously difficult. And it's now 1992. This is where our setting is. The Super Nintendo has taken off with full power and is becoming a household electronic in America almost more than Japan. America is obsessed with the Super Nintendo.
Chugga, choo-choo.
Yes, America, we all love our SNES. The also 92 was a great year. Just saying. I was born in that year. Great year.
I was born in 91.
91,
Sorry.
You were close. Oh, but that's, hey, same SNES birth babies. So Enix had Dragon Quest II not yet released in America for the NES at this time. And decided we're going to stick with our games that sold well in Japan, and we're going to release it on the NES. Dragon Quest III is coming. This decision was horrible. Dragon Quest III was the best selling of the whole series in Japan. Like, it had outsold the rest and was huge. They revamped it for the US with a full prologue, original music, new pieces, and some from Dragon Quest IV, which US hadn't had. They brought music from that in, and it would sell only around 1,000 copies.
Jesus Christ!
And it was reviewed as. Can you give a guess what the reviewer said?
Dated.
It was dated, too old. No one wants to play these old games, which it was. It was like 3 years old at this point.
Yeah.
And Dragon Quest III in Japan sold 1 million copies day one. And an infamous little fun fact, 300 students got expelled for truancy, for trying to get the game at release in the morning.
That's funny.
In America, no one gave a single shit about Dragon Quest III, or Dragon Warrior 3 as it was called.
Right.
9 months after that, they released Dragon Warrior 4. They put almost no effort outside of a base translation. They didn't even care. They're like, just do that. And it sold even more copies than Dragon Quest 3 in Japan, and it ranked the 4th most sold Famicom title. America? Guess what the reviewer said?
They didn't say anything.
They said it was super dated.
Oh, no.
Came out in America, sold worse than Dragon Quest III. This is an NES game coming out a year after the Super Nintendo's released. People weren't buying NES games anymore. So that was a horrible decision to even spend the money on this. And it sold so badly, Dragon Warrior 4 is now one of the rarest games to find in the world.
Yeesh.
So collectors, it's a huge collector item to have this game. Enix America, after this, continued to localize non-Dragon Quest titles in America, but Dragon Quest pretty much got shut down. Dang. Even in Japan, it started having huge... This was just such an expense for them to run their own company in America, and has been met with constant failure. Jeez. They released one game, which a lot of people liked, called Evo Search for Eden, which was a game about raising dinosaurs in America.
Yeah.
I know people of our community have recommended some of our streamer base to play it before. But it still didn't sell very well in America. It just kind of has a cult following now, but it was better than Dragon Quest games sold in America. And their last gambit was they're going to hire a full American staff. We're going to make an original Super Nintendo game, and it was called King Arthur and the King's Justice.
Oh, my.
The Knights of Justice, sorry. King Arthur, Knights of Justice. And you probably haven't heard of this.
No, I have not.
Because it was so bad that when it released in America, it barely sold 1,000 copies, and the reviews said, you guessed it, an extremely dated game that seems like a ripoff of Secret of Mana, and it looks ugly.
Oof.
And a fun fact about this game and how bad it was, it had a password system in a full RPG, not save files.
Yes.
Which, that's rough. That's a rough thing. For the Super Nintendo era, that's rough.
That's super rough.
And in 1995, Enix America shut its doors.
Yeah.
There'd be no more Enix games in America. Dragon Warrior was dead. During this time period, just do a short catch-up, Final Fantasy released in America, setting them as the huge top dog, basically in the world at the moment for games. Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were out in Japan, and Sakaguchi directed those titles. A huge show of the style of the company Square was compared to Enix during this time. Nasir, the Iranian American, he worked on both 2 and 3. His work visa expired.
Oh, no.
So he had to go back to America. So where Enix was known as a scummy company, what Square did, they moved their entire dev staff to America to keep working with him. They said, you're a respected member of the team. We're not going to let you down. Like, you're going to work with us. We're going to work with you. They all moved to America and finished 2 and 3 before going back to Japan. And that was Nasir's end of his involvement with Square.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, but it's they show Square actually cared. Like, they were a caring company.
Except for maybe about their devs, because he was kind of the goblin.
Yeah, well, yeah, he bad, maybe some fucked up work ethics, like as far as like hours put in, but they were making good products.
They liked the
people
products, they believed
after the work, they were super happy with what they did. You know, they stayed on board and they looked back on it as a positive thing.
Yeah.
They started localizing Final Fantasy 2, which did sell well in Japan, but not as well as Dragon Warrior was selling. And it was being made in America. Final Fantasy 3 also sold extremely well in Japan, but some localization problems started happening, namely of which the same thing as Enix, the Super Nintendo, came out. Square, however, said, you know what? We're not going to even do this. We're going to make Super Nintendo games. Like, why bother with this old console?
Sure.
So, Final Fantasy 2 got scrapped in America, never came out, which was, by the way, 90% complete.
Oh, wow.
And they completely ditched the product, deleted the files, we're done, get rid of it.
Jeez.
They started working on Final Fantasy 4 for the Super Nintendo. Here's another fun fact just about this crazy developmental hell. They started making 4 games at once. Wow. 3 and 2 for localizations, which were already canceled. But they were also making Final Fantasy 4 for the Nintendo and Final Fantasy 5 for the Super Nintendo. So, because of how long localization ended up taking, and they canceled those projects, they also canceled Final Fantasy 4 for Nintendo and said, let's just make Final Fantasy 4 for the Super Nintendo, and renamed what they were working on as 5 as 4, and what this original 4 was, we'll never know.
Oh,
That's just a
wow.
game lost to history.
So
It
there
was
was
just thrown away.
There was just another game.
There was a whole nother Final Fantasy made that we never will
Do
see.
you think they may have recycled it in a future Final Fantasy?
It's possible, at least some of the ideas, but as far as we know, we don't have any actual concrete connections for that.
That's wild, actually.
And Final Fantasy IV, they didn't want to release the old. They didn't want to release it, so they, like I said, on the NES, so they made it on the Super Nintendo, and it would be the first massively scaled, and well-sold 16-bit RPG title to be released in the West, and it would be named Final Fantasy II because they didn't have a 2 release in the West. And this is, which to so many people to this day has led to the confusion of the Final Fantasy numbering system. So I'm gonna refer to it as 4. I'm not gonna call it 2. This is Final Fantasy 4, and in the West, it sold very well. However, did not sell as well as Final Fantasy, the original.
Yeah.
So Square considered it a failure, commercial failure. They thought it was a great game, but they considered it a commercial failure.
Sure.
And they decided we're gonna make a game for Americans. It's gonna be something simpler because 4 was probably too hard. We're gonna call it Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. If anybody knows what Mystic Quest is, it is such a bad game. It is like Final Fantasy for kindergartners.
Oh my.
And it's so dumbed down that that they tried to sell it as an American version of Final Fantasy for more action game players. And in Japan, I mean, it's actually called Final Fantasy USA. That's the name of the game.
Oh my, that sounds so sad. Don't do that.
And yeah, no. So
That's racist.
exactly what you just said is exactly what critics in Japan said, that it is offensively pandering to its intended audience. So even the Japanese are like, what is wrong with you guys? Like, that's not how you sell a game.
Americans are dumb.
Yeah, and they're like, you guys are messed up. And Final Fantasy V was being localized at the same time, but was canceled because its humor, which is what it was based on, it was a comedy game. The story was being seen as something that couldn't be understood in America. Like, it was such a difference in cultural humor that it wouldn't translate well, so they ditched the whole project, which actually made, another fun fact, Final Fantasy V the first ever fan translation game.
Oh,
Because
wow.
3 companies had attempted translating this game and all dropped it, and people had put together that effort and made their own bootleg Final Fantasy V Super Nintendo cartridges.
Jeez.
And and they circulated around America for a little while, but they didn't gather any attention. Mm-hmm. So their next big title was Final Fantasy VI. Anyone who hears me listens to me rant about Final Fantasy, this is my favorite Final Fantasy, bar none. Whoa, stop, Alexa, stop. There's a crazy timer going on. Alexa, stop.
What are you doing? What's wrong with you?
Why was that set? So Final Fantasy VI started development in 92, which again, great year. Spent 1 year in development. Sakaguchi at this time was promoted to vice executive president of Squaresoft, and he wasn't able to directly work on the game, so he hired 2 people, Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, who are both very well known now, especially Hiroyuki Ito. He is one of the biggest writers for games in Japan. They would begin directing this game, and the ideas they brought made this game a massive critical success. It's released under the title Final Fantasy III, granted it place among the top 10 selling games of all time.
That's amazing.
However, it did not sell as much as Final Fantasy, the original. So Sakaguchi said it was a commercial failure. And despite its acclaim, and while rewards are great, it didn't get the numbers they wanted. And this was RPGs. RPGs were expensive to make. It took a lot of effort. You had to get writers, you had to get musicians, you had to do a lot of real talent in these things.
Yeah.
And the RPG started to fall out, specifically in America, which, while, of course, they were making games in Japan, Square had now focused on America. America was their fucking honeypot.
Well, yeah.
Like, that's where they were making their fucking bank. Enix had Japan under their thumb. Square had the world outside Japan on their thumb. And while RPGs did have to fall out, there was 3 major Square titles that came out. One Square Associated, which was in 1995. Nintendo released Earthbound for Super Nintendo, which was not made by Square, but many of these same developers worked on the project.
Oh.
And then Square had its own release, which was a huge success in August 1995, which was worked with the previous artist we had brought up, Akira Toriyama, to create Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
Everyone knows Chrono Trigger. People love Chrono Trigger. It was the last huge RPG of the Super Nintendo. The third final RPG for Super Nintendo, which wasn't as big as Chrono Trigger, but made a lot of waves and was made by Square, not a lot of people realize this, was the Super Mario RPG.
Oh, yeah, no, I did know that.
Yeah, there's even a Final Fantasy boss from Final Fantasy IV in the game you can fight in secret.
Oh, I did not know that. That's
yeah,
funny,
there's one of the bosses of Final Fantasy IV makes a little guest appearance in there.
That's cute.
At the end of 1996, something happened. And this happened in the world and changed RPGs forever, which is what they needed because they were becoming stale. The Super Nintendo RPG is something that even I know of as such a stagnant thing. Like there's so many almost clones. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like they're just so similar, trying to be Final Fantasy, or trying to be Dragon Quest. And what happened was the release of a little thing called the Sony PlayStation. In December 1996, that's right, it came out. And what is the PlayStation known for?
3D, baby.
Nintendo had that. What they had was discs.
Oh, well, yeah.
How much more you could hold on a disc than a cartridge was game-changing.
Yeah.
And most RPG developers started saying PlayStation's the way to go. Twisted Metal's right. I think, what were the commercials? Were Crash Bandicoot, Twisted Metal, and Tomb Raider. Mm-hmm. Those were the three things they advertised.
Yeah. Good choices, though.
Yeah, great choices. Twisted Metal, also American. I think Crash Bandicoot. Yeah, Crash Bandicoot's American, too.
Crash Bandicoot's American.
Tomb Raider's Japanese, but the other two are American. So Square was already working on their next title with Nintendo 64. However, the cartridge couldn't hold all the data they needed. And in the end, they ended up, not Nintendo, broke their contract. And says, sorry, Nintendo, we're done with you.
Fuck off.
And this started the huge rivalry between Sony and Nintendo because they lost their Square child to Sony.
Yeah, well, their ambitions were too great.
And so their next game, some people probably know, it's pretty popular, Xenogears.
I do not know that.
Xenogears is an RPG game. Didn't come out, though, because it was going to have a different name. And then they went with a different game. A different project was being made and took the name Xenogears is going to have.
Okay.
And that name was Final Fantasy VII.
Oh.
We all know Final Fantasy VII.
Yes.
Final Fantasy VII is
the
what
love child.
is
the favorite.
Final Fantasy VII released and changed the entire games industry literally overnight for multiple reasons. Every studios around the world had to pay attention to this game because when it came out in 3 days in Japan, it sold 2 million.
Oh.
America, holy shit. So before we get into that, Square didn't even want to put it out in America because of the failures it had with localizations previously.
Sure.
And they didn't want to make another game called Final Fantasy IV. And Sony literally begged them. They said, please, let us translate this game for you. We will do the work. Let us put it out in America for you. And one of the main reasons they wanted to do this was to fuck with Nintendo because they knew it was originally a Nintendo game. And they said, fine, we'll do it. And Sony spent $40 million marketing this game. 20 million of that was in America alone. And when it released, it officially fucked the world. So it sold 500K in the first month, which that's good, but that's that's not 2 million in 3 days.
No, it's not.
But something happened that never happened. It didn't stop selling. 3 months, 1 million. 5 months, 5 million. To this date, it has sold 12, almost 13 million copies. And it's still actively selling on PlayStation Network, Switch, and Steam.
Wow.
This game brought RPGs back into the world.
It cannot be killed.
And it showed how major story and lore can help a game succeed. And that's when the world started really being like, we should write stories for our games.
Weird. What a fucking idea.
If you notice, all these heavy narrative games started after 97 because of Final Fantasy VII's impact. Now, 97 was another year for Enix to come back. They got a contract with Nintendo to release one game called Mischief Makers, the N64, which failed. And they got a deal with the company Atlas, which Atlas is the company who makes Shin Megami Tensei and Persona.
And Snowboard Kids.
And Snowboard Kids, yep. Which was at the time their big thing because the N64 era.
Yeah.
And Shin Megami Tensei was their big thing in Japan. Persona, I think the first game was just about to come out as well.
Nice.
But they sold a game, which I wrote here in my notes, a horrible game named Eggs of Steel, which was a platformer game where you played as eggs who were construction workers.
Okay.
It sold so badly. It just, massive trash.
Sure.
In 97, Enix worked with Sony, however, to release a game called Star Ocean. A lot of people have probably heard of Star Ocean. This would be the first success of Enix in the world. It did very well, and it allowed them to open their American division again.
Oh.
And they even tried to release Bust a Groove 2, which is kind of a cult following game now. But it sold so bad in the West that it is now also one of the biggest collector's items for people who collect old games. Star Ocean did well, but its numbers were actually almost identical to Final Fantasy VI. And this is after Final Fantasy VII.
Right.
So, pretty much not a great game. It's actually a good game. I've played this game when I was a kid on the PlayStation 1. It's called Star Ocean: The Second Story. It's a good RPG, but it's nothing like 7. It's not that crazy level.
Yeah. Not
as much production. But Enix has now actually become known in the world as a collector's game company.
Yikes!
Like, they were known for failing, and now we're heading towards the end of this whole story.
Sure.
And it's gonna start with a talk about stonks. Enix and Square were both suffering from stock flow.
Yeah.
Because in games, you make a game, sells huge, Final Fantasy VII, your stocks rise like crazy. But then you don't release a game for another year, and your stocks slowly start to go down. Enix and Square both had the same problem. RPG games were taking a lot of work to make, a lot of budget to make, a lot of work, like we said earlier.
Yeah.
Composers, artists, it's a lot of stuff to do. And it made the development time even longer for these stocks to start to dwindle, and people started worrying about, investing in these companies. Yeah. And the thought was always said around the offices of Square, if we flop a game, we're done, because the stocks won't recover. There's no recover period from a stock.
Sure.
From that. But the Final Fantasy series was keeping Square going with 8 and 9. They released and sold extremely well. Not as big as 7, but, they're huge. Yeah. Both those games are also giants in their own. Enix released Dragon Warrior 7 in the US in 2001. And the review of the stock they had a middling stock value at the time, and this was cemented to fail when the reviews for Dragon Warrior 7 in 2001 were that it was a dated RPG.
Oh my god.
It was just a little too old. It was put out on the PlayStation 1 in the era that PlayStation 2 was starting to rise.
Yep.
So the same old Enix issues were keeping them down. But at the same time, this is when Square's hubris would get the best of them.
Oh.
Final Fantasy fans for years had wanted a movie. And due to the popular stories, Square agreed. Let's make a movie. Sure. And in 97, they started work on the infamous story of Final Fantasy Spirits Within. People got super hyped. They opened Square Pictures. And in 2000, they announced it. A full feature-length, realistic animated film directed by none other than the legendary Hironobu Sakaguchi. And it was going to be great, right? How could it fail?
Well, yeah.
So the first issue was they learned Hollywood's not the same as game development.
It's not at all.
They put aside $70 million to make this movie.
Mm-hmm.
Week 1, the budget had now risen to $107 million. Just on actors, voice acting, recording, the technology needed to make a feature-length film at that high-fidelity graphics was insane. And then they needed to spend an additional $30 million on advertising, making a total of $137 million for the budget. It had a lot of hype. It released in 2001 and made a grand total of $85 million.
Not quite breaking even.
No, this was a huge flop and the first failed gamble by Square. But luckily for Square, 2 other massive games, which we all know came out this same year. The first of which, Final Fantasy X. Many people compare it or see it better than 7, and sales-wise would agree. It sold more than 7. In Japan especially. To this day, it is the #1 Final Fantasy game in Japan. And another title came out, Kingdom Hearts.
Oh, wow, we're that old now. Okay.
They both came out the same year in 2001.
Right. Oh,
And
God.
that was a lot of money. You know, those were two huge titles that gave Square a ton of money. However, they had just lost a fuck ton of money and reputation on that movie.
Oh, well.
So, you know, they're in a pretty shitty spot, and their stocks were a disaster because Square Pictures had to be shut down. And they needed something really big to like save their company. So Square did something that was so unexpected and one of the boldest plays ever to happen in the games industry when they met with another company, their biggest rival, who in the past released games that blew them out of the water and were in dire straits, Enix. Enix was in such a rough spot because other failed company deals, namely Atlas Nintendo, that we mentioned earlier, but Square's Western fame was a giant that they couldn't ignore. Yeah. And since Final Fantasy VII, even more than they cared more about being friendly with Square at this point than Nintendo because of Final Fantasy VII.
Sure.
And in the world, Square was now the #1 adult video game creator. Not like nudity, but like, mature, basically. The games were serious and more dark. They weren't Nintendo games.
Yeah.
And they came to an agreement, and the two companies merged into what we know as Square Enix.
Yeah.
So
there it is. There's Square Enix.
That's basically the end of the story. That's how Square Enix came to be, from two companies that fucking hated each other. One of which that was a huge fucking failure, being Enix, and the other was a giant that just made a movie that destroyed their entire business.
Can you imagine? Like, oh god. Like you are successful. You make phenomenal games. You make one gamble, and it shuts the whole thing. Like, it's like, no, you can't even make the good stuff anymore. It's like, what?
It's looking at it like money wise too. It almost doesn't make sense. Like actual dollar signs. Like Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy X made way more money than that movie did.
Sure. Yeah.
It made enough money to make up for it. But stocks are what matter.
Yeah. Which again, I don't understand and hate it.
Yeah, no, it doesn't make sense. You know, obviously economics. I know it makes sense, but I'm saying like to a person just looking at these numbers, you're like, this is the dumbest thing in the world.
And love and friendship conquered all.
Yeah, basically. Saw that. And what Soundwave said in chat, that's the game industry. Yeah, literally, your flop. But the movie industry too. Don't make video game movies.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bad idea. It's a terrible idea.
And they just announced the Mario movie.
They just announced the Mario movie today.
We were talking about that before we went live.
Yeah, before we went live, we were talking about the cast announcement for the Mario movie and how ludicrous it is.
I like it, except for Chris Pratt.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, we'll see. I actually think it can be good just because of the people behind it.
Yeah. If it's made by the same people who made Lego Movie, I have at least some faith. So
yeah, Illumination, they're a good company.
Yes, yeah, for sure. But
I have a couple final notes here.
Yeah.
Advent Children's a little different because that wasn't a theater release. That was just a DVD release.
Yeah.
So that saves them a ton of money, you know? So a couple final notes here. Dragon Quest VIII came out after this merger for the PlayStation 2, ditching the name Dragon Warrior. That name was gone forever. It's now Dragon Quest VIII. And guess what? The highest selling game in the PlayStation 2.
Wow. In America?
In America, yeah. Highest selling game, Dragon Quest VIII.
I would have never guessed that.
It's actually only America, not Japan. Just America.
I would have said so many other games before that.
Yeah. This was towards the end of its kind of era too, you know? Like, or I guess 2003 is kind of like it's kind of coming towards its end, you know.
Midlife, yeah, because the PS3 came out in 2006 or 7.
Yeah, so it's like got a couple years left, but this game fucking sold troves. Dragon Quest became a title in the West, the first Enix success outside of America, outside of Japan ever, and their first release as Square Enix.
I bet that must have felt good for the people who worked on it.
No, the people there was a lot of people worried about this merger because Enix didn't have a good reputation.
Yeah,
and attacking that name on Square could have done more harm than good. But the bottom line was, with two companies that make games, making games together at the same time, you now don't have that stock drop period. Because one company makes the game, the other company makes the game. You know, there's that they make games in between each other. Yeah. So your stocks can stay at high value.
You stay afloat. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Square Enix in 2008 became Square Enix Holdings, which was a holding company made to consolidate all their branches into the one unified company that we now have today, Square Enix. Square Enix value has been raising every single year substantially, even with games like Final Fantasy 15, which while it wasn't the biggest critical success, it still sold an ass load of copies. And what people fucking love it. There's got a huge fan base. They just keep making more and more money. Their next huge project, Final Fantasy 16, is gathering some of the biggest hype ever for PlayStation 5. Ongoing MMO projects such as the large and now recently massive fucking Goliath Final Fantasy 14 Online. And they also are just constantly publishing tons of works for other companies. And to this day, Square Enix is one of the biggest game companies in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in, like, having, by the way, the dumbest like, the Sony versus Nintendo shit was totally alive when I was a kid. Like, because I remember I had friends who had PlayStation, because I was a Nintendo kid, because my parents were scared of the games like Twisted Metal. They're like, that's gory. And so, like, I was the Nintendo kid, which, don't get me wrong, I fine with that, but I also love PlayStation, so that's irrelevant. But, like, getting caught up, it's because I wanted to bring that up before, but I wanted you were on a roll, so I was like, just keep going. But, like, but I wanted to bring that up is that, like, I remember that fight, because I had a couple friends who were like, they were the Final Fantasy kids. Like, they're like, yeah, but have you played Final Fantasy 7? And I was like, yeah, I don't really care for Final Fantasy. I'm more of the Zelda guy. And we got into the argument of, like, what franchise is better. And it was, like, the most fucking ridiculous thing in the world. Because, for one, they're entirely different. Like, and the way they're both set up, lore-wise, the way they're set up in terms of story and background, and also the way they were, like, conceived. But, like... But it was that much of a culture thing where, like, they really wanted you to pick one or the other, and that also started off the competition in general because then even like Microsoft, when the Xbox came out, that started the same thing. It was just like, now it becomes this gigantic us versus each other. It's only been, I think, in the last, honestly, like, I wouldn't even say 10 years. I'd even just say 5 or 6 years that video game industries are kind of being forced to come together because people are like, hey, we're playing video games on different consoles and we want to still play together, and you guys got to get the fuck over it. Like, and I think that's kind of like the gamers and the artists in which game who make the games are kind of becoming that voice of saying that, like, we understand that this is all capitalist competitiveness and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, it's like, the best thing you can do is give everybody as much access as possible. You know? Yeah,
well, now we're living in the age now where the console wars are only lived on by fans, not the companies.
Exactly, and honestly, like, and personally, I don't have like, if somebody gave me the new Xbox, I'd be like, great, that's awesome. Maybe I'd sell it right now because I need money, but like,
yeah, I would trade it for a PlayStation.
But the thing, but like my point is, though, if people kept giving me stuff, I'd just be like, I'd be happy with it, because it's like, at the end of the day, I can still play so many games on so many of these different consoles. Yeah. So it's just like, there's that competitiveness is kind of, it just kind of, again, it's dying down. Although, obviously, PlayStation 5, if we've been paying attention to releases, is just stacked, dude.
Yeah. I mean, so stacked. It's just, we live in the era where Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony are working together, which is fantastic. Yeah. They're making games all together. They're releasing games on all 3 platforms with crossplay, which is a huge deal.
Yeah. The only problem I have is that, again, there are now they're at the point where there's 2 mega corp, because, like, this is the part where I was like I can't talk necessarily about the history, the names of where people went, which was, like, fascinating, by the way, but, like, I know about, like, the mergers, the marketing strategies, the like the economy part of it a little bit more. So it's just like, because that's kind of where we're at now. We're blessed in the video game industry because, like you said, we have this connectivity. But what makes me so nervous is the fact that it's still in control of these mega, like, corporations now. Because now these companies, like, the likelihood of them going under is slim to none. Like, you know what I mean? There's, like, Sony, PlayStation, Nintendo. Like, it's the only one I could see going down is Microsoft, just because they're constantly getting attacked and sued. But but like,
as also, just to bring up another point, 2 more points, just to go on just to finish another note here.
Sure.
Dragon Quest X. Fucking huge. Massive game right now. Still, it's on Switch, it's on PlayStation 5, it's on everything, it's on Steam. Nice. I have never in my life played a Dragon Quest game, but I have been tempted to pick up Dragon Quest X. It's got the full Toriyama art, everything.
Nice.
He did the whole game, and everyone has told me it's so good. And one of the best parts is you can literally press a button to switch it from full 3D Toriyama world graphics to a gorgeous 32-bit pixel graphics.
Aww.
Like, the whole game, you can just do that. You can switch back and forth, which is great. So Enix, the Enix side of things are since 8 haven't let up. Like they're doing huge. Enix is because they got fucking picked up by their bootstraps, and Square taught them how to make fucking games.
Just give them a little spanking in the ass.
Yeah. And then back when we were just talking about where these people went, none of those people work at Square anymore. They've all moved on. Sakaguchi, he is known as the father of the RPG. He's the one name that kind of stood out in this whole thing. Yuji Hori also, who created Dragon Quest. Those Hori and Sakaguchi are two huge names in video game history. Sakaguchi still makes games with his own company, Mistwalker. He made a game called Lost Odyssey on the Xbox.
Yeah.
That was a Sakaguchi game which sold extremely well in America, and he made it for American audiences. That was his one of his own, like, he kind of competed against Square's Final Fantasy X at the time to kind of like be like, hey, check this out, friendly like. And he has only made a couple games because he's kind of loaded. This Final Fantasy is he still has the royalties. It's his thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm
saying. It's his creation, so he's living off that, and he never needs to do work again. So he just makes games for fun. And he actually recently made a game. What's it called? I actually really want to try it. I think it's on the phone for free. It's a fully free RPG game. Fantasian is what it's called. And it's a game that uses like very high fidelity graphics, and the backgrounds are all miniature model sets.
Oh.
And it's just a passion project he made.
I love that.
And it did extremely well. People really loved it.
That's great.
It's out. You can play it now. It's cool. I've heard nothing but good about it. MJ, I remember you streaming Lost Odyssey.
Yep, I remember those streams.
It was a lot of talking. I remember that. I never played that game. But yeah, Sakaguchi only makes games he likes making now. He's purely just does it for the fun, which is good. His goblinness has subsided. That was a note I saw. He's now known as the grandpa, not the goblin.
Oh, well, that's nice.
Where he's super nice, and he tries to encourage his staff to become the goblins, not himself.
Oh, okay. I get it.
Suzuki, who was the first guy to be on board, became the president of Square, succeeding Miyamoto.
Oh.
He stepped down, I think, in 2015 from Square Enix, or 2010 from Square Enix, and left it. He left it. He's just doing his. I don't know what he's doing now. I couldn't really find information. I think he's retired. They're old, so I think he's retired.
Go out on top, baby. Get out of there.
Uematsu, prayers to him. He just announced he's officially receding from colon cancer.
Oh, wonderful.
So he's in recovery. He announced that at Final Fantasy Fan Fest. Still with Square. Still making all the music. He loves it. He says he's made some of his best pieces ever. He said he'll never make better music than he has. Final Fantasy soundtracks are the most popular listened to soundtracks online of any game.
Aww.
That's just like statistically on Spotify, they're number one. On YouTube, they're number one. Like, it's just Final Fantasy soundtracks are so good.
Aww.
And so many vast different styles. He even writes the music for the band The Primals, which is the Final Fantasy 14 developer band. Which cool. They started off as a band doing hit music Final Fantasy series, and now their music is in Final Fantasy 14, like original music, like to go with boss fights and shit.
Yeah.
And they perform every fan fest. Uematsu came up on stage at the last fan fest in 2021. Yeah, 2021, early 2021, and did a famous singing of the meme song La He from Final Fantasy 14, where a woman screams La He over and over again. He sang it and played the whole song on the omophone. You know what that is? That little like face with the little thing.
Oh yeah,
that makes a screeching noise. He did the whole song on that while screaming the lyrics. So he's a great dude. That's when he announced, I'm recovering from cancer. I haven't been making music a lot because I was suffering from cancer. Didn't tell anybody. But he's receding. So
remission.
Remission, that's what it's called.
Yeah, I got you.
I was like, man, what is it? I literally grew up surrounded by cancer, and I can't remember what it's called.
Recession.
Recession.
No, that's what we're in right now economically.
Yes, got that. So we're a cancer.
Yes, America's a cancer. Jesus. And that's what you should take away from this whole thing about Final Fantasy and Square Enix. America's a cancer. I'm just kidding.
Also, I even got this cool picture. So he and Sakaguchi also work together all the time. There's a picture of them right now. That's like at FanFest.
Oh, we gotta see this.
They're just gonna pop up on stream. They're extremely good friends.
Oh.
So there they are nowadays as old men being bros.
They look sweet though. They look good.
Yeah, no, exactly. Good. So you can see that they're all still in cahoots with each other. They love automaton. Grand Fubard said it. They're all still hanging out. They're like shit. Masafumi Miyamoto, I believe he passed away.
Oh.
Let me see. He weirdly enough has like no information on him. Like everything I talked about in this is his entire biography. No, he's still alive. He's still alive.
Good.
He's 64. Okay, he just hasn't done anything since the 80s. Like he's just nothing.
I mean, why not?
I think he just bakes money for Square Enix. That's like his. He's just like his legacy, and he doesn't do anything.
Well, good for him. Fuck it.
Yeah, he did that. Tanaka has moved on to many other studios over the years. He's responsible for the Saga Frontier series, which is a very another popular RPG series. And he's still doing that. Anyone else we talked about? Oh, Akira Toriyama.
Yeah,
I mean, he's going. You know,
he's
still working with Square Enix. You know, he still does Dragon Quest, but he also does all the Dragon Ball stuff. And another fun fact I wrote down: during the creation of GT, which he hated. I'm sure you know this story.
Oh yeah, he hated GT.
Hated GT.
Yeah.
He took as much breaks from it to work on Dragon Quest as he possibly could. He tried to push off GT work to work on Dragon Quest.
God, GT was so bad too.
Yeah, he was forced into making it. It was a contract thing.
It was bullshit.
Yeah, and so it's just like, he's also in a pretty good spot right now.
Yeah, he's doing fine.
Yuji Hori, he doesn't work with Square Enix anymore either. I think he was a guest developer for Dragon Quest X. But he pretty much does that. Sugiyama, who made the music for Dragon Quest, is also still doing it.
Wow. Yeah.
He writes it, but he can't compose it anymore because he cannot stand.
Aww.
He's very old. He was already old when he started working on these games in the 80s, so he's extremely old now. But he loves Dragon Quest, and he said he loves the fans and loves trying to interact with them at conventions and stuff if he can.
That's the sweetest thing ever.
He was a pop writer. He wrote some of the biggest hits in Japanese pop music in the 80s.
That's awesome.
And he ditched it entirely for video games.
Well, video games can be pretty damn wholesome.
Yeah, well, it just goes to show you that, the 80s was such a good time for game development because it was such a new frontier.
Yeah.
It wasn't so business as it is nowadays. Yeah, that's the whole story basically of Square Enix and where they are today.
That's wonderful. I mean, yeah, when once you said that the company's name was Square, I went, huh.
Yeah.
I wonder where this is going. That's when I figured. That's when I started figuring out what it was, because I wasn't sure exactly what specifically we were going to be talking about. I knew.
Yeah, because it starts out unless you know who Sakaguchi is, there's no connection.
Yeah.
Or Uematsu, of course. Uematsu is a massive composer. I know you don't have a connection to him because you've never played Final Fantasy games, so it's not like a thing in your head. But like, it's just his music he's so good at it. He said his magnum opus is the song "Dancing Mad," which is the final boss fight theme of Final Fantasy VI. He said he will never make music better than that, and if you listen to that track, it is absolutely insane. He's most known for One Winged Angel, which is the Sephiroth theme song.
Ah, right.
But at every Distant Worlds, which is that's the Distant Worlds is the world touring Final Fantasy music. It's all Uematsu's music. And they tour the world, and they do it every year. They do a different set. They always play those two songs. Those are always played because it's such a huge homage to him.
I imagine it would be.
Now basically he just does. He didn't do a lot of 15, but he did some of 15. I know he's doing some of 16, but I think he just likes working on 14. I think he said 14 is like his passion project for music because it's an MMO, so it's got such a big variety of settings and themes.
Yeah, and you could do so many different things, they keep updating it, don't they? So
yeah, new expansion comes in a couple months.
Yeah, so probably might even have new music. Who knows?
Oh yeah, no, 100% does. It's gonna have new songs. The theme song for the trailer is a fucking banger.
Nice.
So there you go.
That's awesome. But so if that's about it and wraps it up, then well, thank you guys for hanging out and listening to the wonderful story of Square Enix, and for our second episode of Lore Lords. Tom, the announcer guy, you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I didn't go home. I have nowhere to go. Can I sleep on the couch?
No.
Oh, fuck. All right, I guess I'll just go sleep in the dirt again, I guess.
Only if he takes a shower before he comes in next time.
Yeah, no, I that was my bad. I really should have. I gave him a burner phone, and I think he thinks that he needs to light it on fire when he gets a text message. So.
Oh, I see.
Anyway, thanks for the lore. Yeah, this was great. I love it that we want to do both like fiction and nonfiction, go over all sorts of cool stuff. You know, last week was Dragon Ball, and basically a very specific thing about Dragon Ball too. It wasn't even just like the story.
This actually, my writing for this started off as just the first Final Fantasy game. And like what to get to that point, and then I realized it got fucking insane because of the Enix involvement, and I loved the fact that Enix just fucking sucked so bad.
Yeah, seriously. Every time they tried to do anything in America, just sucked ass. But anyway, yeah. So thanks again, and you want to just end our recordings, and then we can continue bantering while I set everything
exactly.
up?
Let's end the recording now.